Well, we begin again to share some ideas that we can think about before we discuss them on Sunday. And we've been dealing with the question, what is the church? And that's sort of neat because we're going to discuss it on Pentecost Sunday. And Pentecost is the celebrating the birth of the church. And so it's really appropriate what we've been dealing with in May leading up to Pentecost Sunday. And we've talked about, the many faces of the church. We've talked about the foundation of the church being God. We talked last week about how the church responds to evil in the world with love and compassion and empathy and care. But this week we're going to take a little bit different slant at looking at what many people talk about and refer to as the predicament of the church. And the predicament of the church is described as being a minority. Now, that's a hard pill to swallow because none of us like the feeling of being a minority, but that's reality, that's a fact. It's a hard pill to swallow because the condition of being a minority is oftentimes developing the attitude of helplessness. You just feel helpless. Now, to get into and to understand the dynamics of being a minority, I think we need to look at what it means to be a majority. And the satisfaction of being a majority is that a majority controls and dominates. Now, occasionally in history, the church has been a majority. Let's look at a couple of illustrations. When the Roman Empire was developed and the Roman Catholic Church emerged at the same time, we have what historians refer to as the Roman Catholic Empire, existing for hundreds of years. At that time, the church was, in a real sense, in the majority. The Pope really ruled over many countries in Europe. But the problem with that period of history is that if you look at what happened when the church was the majority, it became pretty self-serving rather than other-serving. Because that's the peril of being the majority, is that you do things and say things and enable things to happen that are self-serving rather than other-serving. Another illustration is when I was in high school. I graduated in 55. For some of you, that was a long time ago. I always refer to it about the time Columbus came, but it's been quite a few years ago. But in post-World War II USA, the church was nearly a majority. Let me just give a practical illustration. Karen and I attended East High School in Wichita. At that time, one of the largest high schools west of the Mississippi River in the United States. And the largest club at Wichita East was the Bible Club. Had more students in it than any other activity at Wichita East. Why? Because the church was nearly a majority. On a national scale, some of my friends who were bishops and retired when I was elected would tell the stories back in the late 40s and 50s that when the American Council of Roman Catholic Bishops and the Council of Bishops in the United Methodist Church, the Methodist Church then, would get together on some issue or some proclamation or something that was important to the American public, those two entities almost controlled the flow of legislation. Why? Because the majority of members of Congress were a part of the church. And when two large churches sort of merged in their interests, Indeed, there was a sense of control. There was a sense of dominance. Wednesday nights were protected. Nothing was scheduled on Wednesday nights. When I was on the school board in Derby for 8 years, we couldn't schedule any school activity on Wednesday night, and indeed Sundays were just, untouchable. Why? Because the church was nearly majority, but what happened during that time? Again, the peril of the majority emerged, and that is that the church and a lot of its activities, both local and nationally, became self-serving rather than other-serving. So that's what it means to be a majority. And in light of being a minority, when we're no longer in control, we're no longer dominant, the peril of being a minority is that all of a sudden we feel helpless. We're discouraged. We cannot get our way. And that's when the New Testament really emerges as a very helpful guide and resource for life. Because indeed, when the church was born at Pentecost, it was a minority in all capital letters, very, very few. But as a minority in every community, including the community of Corinth that Paul wrote a letter to about love, this is what he said about love to the church at Corinth. And these are the words from the Message. Love never gives up. Love cares more for others than for self. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. Love doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head. Love doesn't force itself on others. Love isn't always me first. Love doesn't fly off the handle. Love doesn't keep score of the sins of others. Love doesn't revel when others grovel. Love takes pleasure in the flowering of truth. Love puts up with anything. Love trusts God always. Always looks for the best. Never looks back, but keeps going to the end. Now, I challenge you to think for a moment and just replace love with the church as a minority. The church as a minority never gives up. The church as a minority cares more for others than itself. The church as a minority doesn't want what it doesn't have. The church as a minority doesn't strut, doesn't have a swelled head, doesn't force itself on others. The church as a minority isn't always me first. You see, all of a sudden we understand that as a minority, we've got something going for us other than dominance and control. What we have going for us is the power of persuasion and influence. Now, a lot of people refer to that as witness. I shy away from the word witness simply because it comes with so much baggage. When you say the word witness, all kinds of meanings crop up that you have to unpack before you get to the point. But I choose the words influence and persuasion because they're the words of the most influential thinker in my life, Bob Greenleaf, who wrote the book Servant Leadership. And I've had the privilege of being in a seminar with Bob Greenleaf soon after he wrote this book that sort of gave birth to a whole new understanding of leadership. And he talks about persuasion and influence. And he was a great storyteller. And he told the story of a person by the name of John Woolman. In the middle years of the 18th century, John Woolman was a young man. He was a Quaker, and the Quaker landowners all over the eastern and southern United States were slaveholders. John Woolman came convinced that slavery was wrong, it was an evil, and he decided that he would try to do something about that, even though he stood alone. In 30 of his adult years, from the time he was 20, time he died at 52, he was devoted to going on horseback, one at a time, to visit Quaker slaveholding plantation owners, farmers. And John Woolman was not a strong man physically. He accomplished his mission by journeying up and down the East Coast, sometimes by foot, sometimes by horseback. But he didn't try to convince people that they were wrong. He just tried to convince people the importance of being moral persons. What kind of institution are you building to hand over to your children, he would ask. Person by person, inch by inch, he visited individually, one at a time, persuading people with gentle, non-judgmental argument that a wrong should be righted by individual action. Indeed, now we know that history was written, that the Quakers were the first denomination in America to say to its members, slaveholding is wrong, it's immoral, and as a Quaker, you should free your slaves. All we have is persuasion and influence. But you know something? That might be enough. Instead of a sense of helplessness and bemoaning all of the negative things that are happening, the minority always has the opportunity to share their story, just like John Woolman. Tell the story, to be persuasive, to try to influence, not control, not determine, not to be dominant, but tell the story. And indeed, the wonderful thing about telling the story as a minority, as a church, is that we tell it in love. In the 1 Corinthians 13, the church as a minority never gives up, never cares more for itself than others, never wants what it doesn't have. We don't strut. We don't have a swelled head. We don't force ourselves on others. We aren't the church of me first. Rather, we're the church that indeed has many faces. Its foundation is God. It confronts evil with compassion, care, and empathy. And as a minority, it has the power not to control or be dominant, but rather to persuade and to influence. That is the church as a minority. Begun at Pentecost, exists today, even in the life of Grace United Methodist Church. I conclude this input this morning with really one question that I want you to think about, because it's so easy to think about all the negative things that are going on and what's happening with the majority and what's happening with control and what's happening with dominance. I want us to think about the beauty of the church as minority. And so the question is, what are your stories of the church as a minority today, individually or corporately, who indeed are willing to be the agents of love in the world today, not by dominating, not by controlling, but by being persuasive and being willing to influence others, one person at a time. I invite you to think about those stories. Thank you.